Thank you for joining us at this virtual event as we discuss, beyond coronavirus, vaccination and the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure that in January 2020, none of us could have imagined or predicted the sustained global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The entire UK higher education sector has navigated many challenges in dealing with the impact of the pandemic. At Queen's, our students and our staff have responded with considerable resilience and agility. We've adopted new ways of learning and working, and our researchers are continuing their part in global efforts to understand and to treat COVID-19. I believe that the pandemic has demonstrated the important role universities play in our society and how institutions across the world can work in partnership not only with each other but with industry, with NGOs and with government to tackle global challenges. Indeed, the important research and education undertaken at universities has shaped and informed the global response to the pandemic. Nowhere is this more evident, perhaps, than with the development of the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, as countries worldwide now look to extensive vaccination programmes to combat the virus. Today's event is therefore very timely. At Queen's, we're committed to facilitating debate and discussion on key issues impacting society. So I'm looking forward to our discussions today around vaccination and the COVID-19 pandemic. As our keynote speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sheena McCormack, clinical epidemiologist at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, UCL. Professor McCormack's research focus is the development and implementation of biomedical interventions to prevent or reduce the risk of acquiring HIV. Since 1994, she's worked on early phase HIV vaccine trials in Europe and Africa. I look forward to hearing her experience and her views as we discuss vaccination and the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr Mark Flear, reader in the School of Law here at Queen's, will respond to Professor McCormack. Mark is an expert in the law and ethics of pandemic preparedness, planning and response. Finally, I'm delighted that Anne Watt will then lead us in our Q&A session, and I would encourage you to submit questions to our speakers via the Q&A function. Anne is Director of Pivotal, Northern Ireland's public policy forum, which focuses on evidence-based ideas and policies to improve society, economy and public services. I know that you'll find this event highly informative. At Queen's, we're planning further events, providing opportunities for evidence-based debate and discussion around the global response to the pandemic. Without further delay, I'd now like to hand over to Professor Sheena McCormack.
Thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor, for that introduction and for the invitation to come and speak at this event. It was, I have to say, a challenge, and we're going to the first slide, a challenge to prepare this talk, but a challenge I welcome. So it'll be a little glimpse into beyond coronavirus, but a focus on vaccination and the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the Vice-Chancellor said, it's been an extraordinary global effort in the research sector to get us to where we are today. So I'd like to speak about the journey, how we got here, a little bit about what the trial data tell us, and then end really thinking risks, benefits, and focusing on any gaps that could be critical. So by here, I mean MHRA authorising, and the first national authority to do this, the BioNTech Pfizer, received its emergency use authorisation in December. Followed later that month by Oxford AstraZeneca's effort for their COVID-19 vaccine. And now we're in the midst of the most amazing rollout of a national vaccination campaign across the 4 nations, quite extraordinary. But it's not without its concerns amongst the public. And here, under the Prime Minister's tweet that followed the release of the Oxford AstraZeneca emergency use authorisation, a concern expressed by Mark B. So the MPs and their families will be happy to have the vaccine first. So people have always been concerned about safety and no exception as the regulatory authorities and the health services. So how we got there, this is the most amazing R&D pipeline I can imagine. 60 vaccines in clinical development already, and 172 sitting there in preclinical development. That is a phenomenal number of candidates. And when I look down this list, which might be a little bit small for you, I hope not, I see at the top of it protein subunits. There are 18 of those candidates being looked at. There's a long history of protein subunit vaccines going back many years, a fantastic database across this particular platform of safety. You'll be familiar with hepatitis B vaccine, for example. And then the viral vectors, also quite a long history in this space, and non-replicating ones. DNA vaccines, a little bit more recent and doing very well in the cancer space, particularly. Inactivated virus vaccines, and then RNA vaccines. These are new. We are seeing now the first authorizations for this platform. So what lies behind the infrastructure behind all of these individual programs that are sponsored by legal entities? There is a host of not-for-profit organizations. And the Brighton collaboration followed on from a meeting in Brighton, no surprise there. And they absolutely are committed to looking at the safety of vaccines through rigorous science. So they teamed up with CEPI. CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, set up really on the back of SARS-CoV-1, I guess, and a pandemic concern. And they work together to create SPEAK, the safety platform for emergency vaccines. And how this operates, each individual trial is looked at by independent committees, a data safety monitoring board. Some people call it an independent data monitoring committee. Whatever those names are, that committee is completely independent. But it's only looking at data from that particular trial. And what SPEAK does is provide an expert to attend those meetings and review those data, so they have an opportunity to look across the whole platform, whether that's protein subunits or RNA vaccines. Another organization I wanted to draw attention to is the COVAX organization. This has got 3 pillars related to access, and the COVAX pillar is focused on the access to vaccines. It's the only truly global solution to the pandemic because it is an effort that's trying to ensure all peoples in the corner of the world, every corner of the world, will get access to these vaccines once they're available, regardless of their wealth. And their aim, an ambitious aim, is to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of this year. And then Operation Warp Speed. This is a US coalition. The Department of Defense in the States have a long history of vaccine research and deployment of licensed vaccines, the Department of Health, and they've come together in Operation Warp Speed, very focused on the vaccine distribution process as well as the research. Their goal is to deliver 300 million doses during this year. And they are leveraging existing networks, not least of all the people I work with in HIV vaccines, processes and partnerships that already exist between pharma and academia. And then our own UK Vaccine Task Force, 357 million doses purchased. It's absolutely amazing. Number one objective to secure access, and how well they have done. 40 million doses of the BioNTech Pfizer, 100 million of Oxford AstraZeneca's, and 7 million of Moderna's. So put together enough to vaccinate the UK population. But as you will see, many more that they've purchased with the objective of providing for international distribution. Because we all know we can only really get back to normal as it was before if the world is protected. So they also have an objective to establish a long-term strategy for the future. This is particularly in the area of design and manufacturing, and they're well on their way to achieving that. So I thought it might be interested. This isn't an area of my expertise, but I thought you might be interested to see the cost of development and who paid for it. I know I was interested to see this piece from BBC. Who's funded it? So each of those squares is £100 million, and the blue squares are government. So if we look at AstraZeneca, you will see the investment. I think it's largely been UK, but not just the UK government have put in. An investment from not-for-profit, that would be organisations such as Gates and CEPI, and then the private investment that is coming from pharma itself, which by far and away outweighs the other investors for that product. And then you look across the piece, so the top three, the first three that we have an authorisation for within the UK, the Pfizer and Moderna, are fairly different pictures, but across the whole diagram, the major investor, and therefore in the space of clinical development, the party that's taking the greatest financial risks is pharma. But there's substantial government support in here. So now if we think about who benefits, and again, this is taken from UNICEF, but I found it on the BBC, vaccine makers are charging different prices. Here we've got the prices in dollars, not in pounds, and a range of them. And that's very acceptable because pharma charges different prices according to country income. But you get a sense of the cost of manufacturing and distribution. It's almost always, I think, and it's logical, going to be more expensive for new platform vaccines. The Oxford AstraZeneca one there is sitting there at $4 to $8 in that diagram. And pharma, of course, will stand to make some profit from this, potentially from high-income countries. Governments, of course, will benefit by being able to kickstart their economy. And I imagine and presume that pension funds benefit because pharma is a big space for investment of pension funds. So that's a little glimpse into how we got here. And now a short look at the trial, what the trial data show us. So early trials, we talk about the phase 1, 2, 3, and I know Mark will speak about this, but in the COVID-19 pandemic, we've really divided it almost into two. So the early trials, which is almost like phase 1 and 2 combined, are focusing on immune responses when they're trying to measure the likely effectiveness of their candidate. The binding antibody assays are robust, but I can tell you they're not easy to compare across the papers, but they're certainly quite an easy assay to perform in the lab. The neutralizing antibodies are more difficult. There's much greater biological variability in those assays, and then it becomes even harder to compare them across the published papers. And I would say that's similar for cellular responses. But this is what people are looking at in the early trial when they're looking for a sign of efficacy. Whereas once you move to the late stage 5, typically the phase 3, it's the clinical outcomes that become so critical. And all the COVID-19 vaccine trials have focused on disease. They may have measured it in a different way, but the focus here is disease, particularly severe disease, of course, and ultimately mortality. Infection has been assessed. In some cases, it's only in a subset of trials. So this is looking for the asymptomatic infections as well as those that are causing disease. And at whatever stage of trial you are, you're going to be looking and reporting safety very closely in the first stages. And as time goes on and you begin to characterize the vaccine, then perhaps less frequently. So I'd like to draw from a COVAX, one of the workshops that COVAX organised back in December. And this provides us some glimpse into when the clinical efficacy trials that have been reported already will analyse the immune responses in people who receive the vaccine. And then they'll look carefully for differences between those who did and did not have symptomatic disease, or if they measured all infections, including asymptomatic, they'll look at that too. And the aim of that is to determine something we call the correlates of protection. And what you hope is to identify an immune threshold that tells you who's a responder, who is not a responder, and identifies the time in that individual's life when they're going to need a booster. And an example of this in widespread clinical use that we use in the clinic I work in is the hepatitis B vaccine. If the surface antibody is less than 10, then we will administer a boost dose. So this red circle here can I show you that here, shows you when Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna and Oxford hope to report the correlates of immunity. And that's all in this quarter of 2021. And that will very much influence the design of trials in future, because they will have a target, we hope, to aim for. And it'll also influence very strongly the national vaccine programs and the plans for booster strategies going down the line in subsequent winters. So looking a little bit more closely about something that really intrigued me that was presented at this workshop, in the inset here for the BioNTech Pfizer paper is the neutralizing antibodies. And the red arrow there is showing you where they were at the time of the second dose. So early on here, at this stage here up through to day 8, there's really very little going on in terms of these neutralizing antibodies, the ones that we think are really important for providing protection. And yet in the trial, you see that the two curves, the rate of infections here going up in the placebo arm, separates very clearly early on from those in the vaccine arm. So early evidence of protection here after the first dose at around about day 12. I think it looks like 11 now on that graph, doesn't it? And in the Moderna, this is the other lipid nanoparticle modified RNA vaccine. We see a similar pattern, the inset graph showing low responses at day 15, and yet at day 15, those two curves separating with a much higher rate of infections in the placebo group compared to the RNA. So we wait to see what these teams report, and the Oxford AstraZeneca team too, but it looks as if it could be that the onset of efficacy happens when the antibody response is low to modest. So looking across the piece, I wanted to share something that gives me enormous enthusiasm and confidence, and that's on the bottom line here, the efficacy. All of these studies, well, certainly Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, Oxford, AstraZeneca, and Gamma-Leva, they all were looking at the same, to elicit the same immune response. And all of them have shown very high levels of protection. So this is exciting because it gives you reassurance in each of the individual trials when they're all seeing the same thing. Moving on to that very important and most important aspect, safety. So reactions to vaccines are very, very well characterized. The local and systemic things that happen after a vaccine were experienced by the majority. I've put the graph there of the BioNTech Pfizer one, but it's a very similar picture for Moderna and Chaddock's candidates as well. They tend to be in the first 48 hours after vaccination. They are more frequent in younger cohorts because their immune responses are stronger, so the interaction between the immune response in the person and the vaccine is stronger. They're more frequent after the second dose because there's been an element of priming of the response, and typically it's pain, tenderness, maybe redness at the site of injection, and a sort of flu-like illness in terms of systemic. But it is short-lived, and interestingly, small as it is here, the second column in each of those pairs of columns is what's going on in the placebo group. So even in the placebo group, and it was a true placebo here in BioNTech Pfizer, you're seeing these responses. But what about the more serious responses? And shortly after the program rolled out, both here and in the US, there were cases of anaphylaxis reported. And indeed, with the BioNTech Pfizer, and I suspect it may also be the case with the lipid nanoparticle mRNA Moderna vaccine, anaphylaxis is definitely more frequent than it is with other vaccines. Typically, we'd expect 1 in a million cases to have anaphylaxis, and it seems to be more like 1 in 100,000 for these products. Presents within minutes. It's completely treatable with an injection of epinephrine, adrenaline. It's not usual on first exposure, as you will know if you or friends of yours have anaphylaxis to bees, wasps, and etc. So we do need to understand the mechanism here. Has there been some exposure perhaps to components of the vaccine? It's not going to be the immunogen, I don't think, but it could be the lipid nanoparticle, some components of that. We need to understand what's going on. And I think this demonstrates the speed at which it was picked up and responded to, but actually the importance of ongoing safety surveillance. And I want to recommend this article in the New England Journal of Medicine by Castells and Phillips. It's a really great read to give context to all of this. So what do our regulators authorize a vaccine? They base that on the highest level of evidence, so the placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials for the product. The safety of the population they're responsible for is the most important criteria. And for MHRA, that's the UK population. And then they look at the benefits in the context of that population. And it is granted very much on the basis of that post-authorization reporting that captures the rare events that are not seen even in the large trials. What about our Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunizations? So their recommendations are based on a broader level of evidence, also the highest level of RCTs, but cohort and mathematical modeling studies that have been conducted robustly. And by that, I mean a clear reference group. They stuck to the analysis plan. It was a good plan. Surveillance data, and then expert opinion, which draws on the totality of experience from previous vaccines, previous epidemics, and the role that vaccination has had in controlling epidemics. So their recommendation was to have a 12-week boost. And this expert opinion drew on analysis of the efficacy between day 15 and 21 in the Pfizer-BioNTech, and from the ChAdOx trial, which had some longer gaps. Some participants had longer gaps between their doses. An existing knowledge that longer gaps facilitate immune responses because it allows time to build up immune memory, and the knowledge that natural infection provides protection. So they've been watching how the responses after natural infection wane too. So they're digging down into this BioNTech candidate, the BNT162b2, and their trial. If you look, and I know you can't read it, that's the picture from the paper, but 7 or more days after dose 2, which was their primary analysis, there's a 95% is what they observe as the level of protection, the reduction in the rate of infection. And the 95% confidence interval, so the interval in which we believe that the truth kind of lies, shows that the lower bound's 90%. So we then tend to translate that into saying that it's at least 90% protection. After dose 1, before dose 2, that was only 52% that they observed, and the lower bound's 30%. So at this stage, you can say at least 30%. Now, out of interest, when the WHO launched their vaccine blueprint in April of last year, their target was at least 30% minimum, around that 95% confidence interval, and they were hoping for an observed estimate of efficacy of 50 to 60%. But JCVI, with the help of PHE, focused on the cases that occur between day 15 and 21, because most of the failures of the vaccine happened early on in that trial. And there, the protection is estimated to be 89%, with a lower bound of the confidence interval at least 52%. So this was a strategic decision to achieve high coverage. And something I heard on the radio the other day, which I thought explained this nicely, 2 grandparents as opposed to 1. So high coverage, both grandparents get a single dose, 89% protection, a minimum of 52%. If you go for the double dose, low coverage, only 1 grandparent gets the dose, 95% protection, 90% minimum. So better for that individual, but at a population level, the high coverage is a really important goal. So I think I'm coming now to the last part. We're going to do a quick time check there. A word about risk and age. So the under 50s, in many ways, you could say, get less benefit from the vaccine because they're far less likely to suffer from severe disease as an individual. And actually, because they've got stronger immune responses, they're probably going to have more reactions to the vaccine. The benefit is clear if you're over 50, and with every increasing decade of age, there's a staggering increase in the risk of severe disease. And because immune responses deteriorate with age, they will have less reactions. But without a doubt, everyone will benefit from returning towards normal. We cannot ignore the delays in cancer diagnostics, in access to life-saving surgery, even because there are no ITU beds available. We all suffer as a society for the stress and strain on our health services and the restriction in social contact, which is really not good for anybody's mental health and well-being, not least of all, of course, the impact on the economy. So what are the risks as we look forward beyond where we are now? Well, waning immune responses. So, of course, this is a risk that JCVI examined very carefully, that immune responses could wane over those 12 weeks between the doses, so that protection drops very much to the lower end. This seems a little unlikely, as it doesn't happen after natural infection. And we know a lot of people who have natural infection actually don't make antibody responses. People who had virus-positive infection didn't have necessarily detectable antibody responses. But we see very few cases of reinfection in those who've been naturally infected. And even this morning, I can't find this paper on the preprint server, but here it is in the news. Susan Hopkins from PhD reporting a large cohort, over 6,000 healthcare workers. Only 44 of them appear to have been reinfected. And then the other risk, of course, the we've heard a lot about the new variants, it's mutation and escape. So when does that happen? If the immune response is weak, then the virus may mutate to escape. That could mean no or low protection from the vaccine. It's certainly possible in theory. But for this perfect storm to happen, you need viral replication and weak responses. And we know that happens in natural infection. And also the mutation rate, I think, and there'll probably be more experts in the audience than I am on this, but my understanding is the mutation rate for this virus is not that high compared to other viruses, say, for example, like Ebola, for which there are effective vaccines, which were designed on strains a decade or more ago. So the other, perhaps slightly more practical risk to consider is the supply and delivery chain. The vaccine components, I think there's a little bit of a short supply of the lipids that are needed for the lipid nanoparticles. The capacity for each step in the manufacturing chain through to release. So that's the filling, the labeling, the moving it from A to B. All of that requires the freezers for storing, etc. And then the capacity and space to deliver the program in hospitals, GP surgeries, or sports halls, whatever, all over the world. And then the little things, the glass vials, the syringes, the needles, the PPE, all so critical to delivering this massive program. And so we can mitigate against those things. I think we've been doing it for a while. But there are other mitigations that will have to continue until we reach the necessary level of immunity in the population for control. And that's going to include the social measures. I'd be so interested in the discussion to hear what others think, but it feels to me that we're unlikely to be really free of this before we hit the sort of season when the transmission for these types of viruses go down anyway, the kind of April and beyond. So we need to monitor the cases, particularly among vaccine recipients, very carefully. So the actual infections, the variants that might pop up there, but particularly hospital admissions and mortality, to ensure we're still on track and that the immune responses, even if they don't prevent infection, are not still able to prevent the more severe disease. So I wanted to end, I've not really given you a glimpse beyond, but I wanted to share this feeling I have that we will get beyond, at least in terms of the dominance in the news and media in this year. I think it is, in fairness, extremely unlikely we'll achieve eradication. Apart from smallpox, what else have we managed to do? It's pretty tricky. Some countries have managed to eradicate polio with really good vaccine campaigns, but they have to remain vigilant. It still pops up from time to time. So control is our goal. And I think that we have to sit back, reflect on lessons learned, and we will need undoubtedly to be better prepared for the next pandemic. We won't be able to do that without kickstarting the economy and having money to spend, but we've really got to be more secure in our supply chains next time. We've got to sort out that testing scale up. You know, we've got fabulous labs, but we perhaps didn't join them all together as well as we could have done. We are short of bed and manpower in the NHS, and this is a winter theme. It happens every year, but when you add in this new virus, then you see, and I don't know, one runs out of words really to express our gratitude to the staff who are coping with so many patients, such a service. And then vaccine and manufacturing capacity. I don't think we've really focused on that in the UK before this. And I think COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 has really brought this to the fore and a priority. And the Vaccine Task Force are doing their best to deliver that. So I'd like to acknowledge, I mean, I don't know where you start with this, but definitely the participants who took part in all the trials. They are heroes and heroines of the day. And I hope they feel a pleasure in the global partnership they've taken part in. It cannot be done without them, nor can it be done without the research teams. And you have to include those public health heroes. They're often unsung. They work really hard to provide all the necessary support in behind. And then the not-for-profit infrastructures that I've mentioned during this talk. And none of it can be done without the investment from private donors. Many philanthropic donors dug in their pockets for this, and governments. So that is the end of my talk, and it is my absolute pleasure to hand over now to Mark, who is going to outline the regulatory and legal framework that underpins all of this activity in research and the translation of products from research to clinic. So over to you, Mark. Mark, you're on mute.
Mute. I didn't realise I've just unmuted myself. So hopefully now you can all hear my voice. But thanks again to Sheena. So I'll just say thanks again to Sheena and her introduction of my response or my reflections on her very thorough, wide-ranging talk today. So I'm going to speak to this, so safety and effectiveness, as paramount concerns of the law in relation to vaccines. I'm going to do that by touching on a few of the key things that Sheena's spoken to, so licensing, clinical trials and rollout of vaccines for COVID-19. Just give me a second. Okay, technical difficulty, but anyway. So I'm just going to speak initially to the question of licensing of vaccines. And it's important to realise that they're actually licensed as medicinal products, but to reflect upon what that really means. Well, you can see that in the first bullet point that vaccines are classified as medicinal products under the relevant law applicable within the United Kingdom. Licensing is carried out by the MHRA. There's the insignia there on the right-hand side. It's important to realise that as a medicinal product, vaccines must fulfil requirements for licensing relating to safety and its efficacy, but I'm using the language of effectiveness because it might be more understandable by some of the audience at least, but also quality. And that's also then found within the law itself. Just a very brief mention here that Brexit regulations are relevant, but I'm not going to go into those to any great extent, essentially because they don't detract from, and actually they underpin and continue to underpin this focus on safety and effectiveness as the paramount concerns. One key thing to note, and I think perhaps it's something that I should stress just to tease it out a bit more, is that UK licenses for the COVID vaccines have actually been granted under emergency procedures. They're actually emergency procedures that come from us via EU law. and that continue to be part of our law. But these do also ensure safety and effectiveness. We can see in summary, we can see the focus on safety and effectiveness very apparent here within this particular excerpt from the relevant regulation. So any substance or combination of substances presented as having properties of preventing or treating disease in human beings, or any substance or combinations of substances that may be used by or administered to human beings with a view to, and then it goes on, are classified as medicinal products. So hopefully we can see very clearly that safety and efficacy, or safety and effectiveness, are absolutely central to the licensing of vaccines. Just to move on though, clinical trials are key to licensing. There won't be a license for a vaccine provided unless there is clinical trials data demonstrating safety and efficacy, so that the vaccine is safe and it works. This is, as Sheena had alluded to, the phases, or these are the phases of the clinical trials process. Things are somewhat different given that the vaccines available and that will become available are being authorised, licensed for use on the basis of emergency procedures. But essentially now we're somewhere between phase 3 and phase 4. Things have been reworked somewhat, but the continuing focus throughout is on safety and efficacy, and hopefully that's apparent. You can see that very clearly throughout each phase. I'm going to touch on this a bit more later on, so I'll return to this. But I just want to stress then the importance of safety and effectiveness throughout clinical trials. That indeed includes the safety of trial participants. Now, we can see that very clearly noted here in relation to the regulation of clinical trials. And just in summary, the relevant law is essentially European Union law that is part of, or remains part of, United Kingdom law. That's summarised here. There's the relevant piece of UK law mentioned at the very start of the first bullet. The key point to take away is the general principle underpinning the law in clinical trials, both here in the UK, but also because many of the clinical trials that have generated data for the authorisation of these vaccines have been carried out in the European Union, or indeed outside the European Union. But the central principle remains and must be abided by and shown to be abided by wherever clinical trials are carried out. And that's essentially found in Article 3 of the Clinical Trials Regulation. That isn't going to be and is not part of UK law. But it's also reflected in the body of UK law. It's essentially duplicated. And that's the clinical trial may be conducted only if the rights, safety, dignity and well-being of subjects are protected and prevail over all other interests. And moreover, it's designed to generate reliable and robust data. This is a requirement here then in the UK, in the European Union, but also beyond. I'm going to move on then to reflect a little bit further about the sorts of underpinnings for the law relating to clinical trials, which, as I've said, in turn provides the basis for the licensing of vaccines as medicinal products. The law reflects international ethics codes and to some extent human rights, but it's actually international ethics codes that are most important, in particular because they are referenced in the law itself. Now, there are a number of international ethics codes that are relevant. There's the Nuremberg Code and so-called CHOMS guidelines, especially important for the carrying out of clinical trials in developing countries, but more particularly the so-called ICH requirements for the registration of pharmaceuticals for human use guidelines. There are a number of different kinds of guidelines. One to flag is that on good clinical practice. Here, safety is key, and that's something that, of course, Sheena highlighted very clearly in her talk today. But also, there's the Helsinki Declaration that's provided by or drawn up by the World Medical Association. Now, each of these are actually very clearly embedded in the law on clinical trials. So my talk is probably going a bit quicker than planned, but I was told to keep it nice and short and sweet. So in the interest of trying to create space for questions, but I just want to move then to rollout and then to make some final or concluding points. And in relation to each of these points, of course, there may be questions, and I'm happy to elaborate. So, of course, rollout has begun. That's going at pace, and it's frankly amazing success so far. At least from my perspective, it's really reassuring to see it happening. Changes to the movement of vaccines between the EU and the UK, and in turn between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, have been something that's highlighted in the news recently, quite obviously. It's important, though, not to focus too much on the question of Brexit. It doesn't actually, or will not actually, in the context of vaccines, interrupt supply. There's one thing to note, that supply is maintained through batch testing, essentially. But ensuring that batch testing can be carried out either, for instance, in the European Economic Area, and that comprises mostly the European Union, or in Great Britain, but not necessarily in Northern Ireland itself. So that helps to cut out some if I call it red tape, although it's all very important stuff, this red tape. It's about trying to ensure safety. But still, Brexit is something to think about, but it's not interrupting supply. Supply continues. The UK government, this is another point, has decided to indemnify vaccine producers against liability for harms caused to patients. This has been highlighted to me quite recently as a concern, and actually as a concern that might underpin hesitancy in relation to actually getting vaccinated. But this is actually a common, or the indemnification is actually a common approach adopted by the UK government. It's in the interest of trying to ensure rollout of vaccines for illnesses that are really big public health concerns, and trying to do that as quickly as possible while maintaining safety. So a similar approach has been adopted in relation to, say, HPV, meningitis B, and H1N1, which is perhaps perhaps the most direct analogy to the COVID-19 virus. But it's important to note that although the UK government is indemnifying vaccine producers, those patients that actually do suffer some sort of harm as a consequence of the vaccine, and we anticipate that the numbers will be very, very low, and the literature, as Sheena highlights, really does underline that. The people that do actually suffer harm do or are potentially able to access compensation via the vaccine damage payment scheme. In terms of the safety of vaccine, bearing in mind that they have been, or the vaccines are being authorised under emergency procedures, safety is going to be kept under review by the MHRA, in particular because we've moved essentially into phase 4 because we're in post-licensing now. But there's more data being generated all the time to provide a more complete picture of safety and efficacy of these vaccines, and of course safety above all, really. Licensing, though, important to stress, remains conditional upon this continual demonstration of safety through provision of additional data as it becomes available post-licensing, so as it is generated. So I just want to conclude by underlining the key point, at least or the key points from a legal perspective. Safety and efficacy, effectiveness, what I've been calling effectiveness, are paramount concerns of the law relating to vaccines. This is apparent in a number of ways, in particular the conditions for licensing vaccines at all. But in turn, it's important to remember that vaccines are licensed only if clinical trials data demonstrates their safety and effectiveness. Clinical trials must be performed in ways that protect trial participants and generate data that demonstrate safety and effectiveness for patients. And further data is being gathered and must be gathered to demonstrate the benefits of the vaccine outweigh any potential risks. and that ultimately, of course, as I've been saying, safety and effectiveness are assured. So I think those are the key points I'd like to tease out from Sheena's talk. And essentially then, these are the key concerns that underpin the law on this whole area of vaccination, the licensing, their development, the whole research process, and the rollout and beyond. So thanks so much for your attention, and thanks again to Sheena for her talk today.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can I thank both Sheena and Mark for their interesting and wide-ranging contributions, really helpful and I hope informative for those who are watching and listening today. Can I say at the outset that a recording of the event will be available afterwards, so if you're having any problems with your connection, you'll be able to catch up afterwards, and please do share the event as well with colleagues, family and friends. That would be good to get as wide a reach as possible. Just to introduce myself, my name is Anne Watt. I'm the director of Pivotal, which is an independent public policy think tank in Northern Ireland. And I'm delighted to have been invited by Queen's University to help host the Q&A today. So thank you for your questions. To those of you who have already contributed questions, can I encourage you please to send in a question for the two speakers? You can do that on the right-hand side of your screen in the question function there. Please do send those in, and we'll get through as many as we can between now and 1:30. So I'm just going to kick off with some questions for, I think, probably Sheena in the first instance. There was a question about what percentage of the Northern Ireland population will take up the vaccine. What do we expect? Now, I don't know whether you know that for Northern Ireland, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear what is the expectation amongst the experts about what the take-up will be in the population generally, and how does that contribute towards herd immunity?
So I guess the simple answer is I don't know what the proportion of the Northern Ireland population will be. And I'm sorry, I would have thought if I was going to look that up, I would see what proportion of the Northern Ireland population had the flu vaccine, you know, because that's offered every year. I think that would be a helpful pointer. I think having worked with MHRA's clinical research practice database, my understanding in the UK, in England, in GP practices in England, it's around about 60% for flu. And the incentive to access this vaccine seems much higher, particularly amongst the elderly. I haven't, again, looked in detail at the mathematical models. And really the modelers, I always think it's difficult with any one mathematical modelling study. What's really reassuring is when all the modelers come together and get behind a number, if they are in consensus about the threshold you need. But certainly, Neil Ferguson on the radio today was saying 20% is not enough, and I would agree with that. I think some models have suggested if we can get to 40% immunity, that would be good. So I think if we can achieve 60% or more of vaccine coverage, we will be on our way. But I wouldn't like to put a figure on that with confidence, Anne.
Thank you, Sheena. And just want to kick off for Mark then. A question, if all the safety and efficacy standards were respected in the trials, what was the rationale for changing regulations to allow for emergency approval? Why was that emergency regulation needed if the standards were all met?
Right, well, hopefully, oh yeah, I can see that I'm up. Sorry, I've got a technical problem this end. Well, the short answer is that the regulations haven't been changed. There's been an emergency procedure for probably as long as there's been centralised European Union law on this question. So that's for getting on 20 years, 16 or more years at least. So there hasn't been an introduction of an emergency procedure. The procedure was already part of the law. It's part of the law in the United Kingdom, and that's as a consequence of European Union law that the United Kingdom helped to design. the European Union was actually, or rather the UK was actually a champion of this within the European Union when it was a member. This procedure is also in place elsewhere in Europe, so in the European Union, and that includes European Economic Area countries such as Norway. But there's also an emergency procedure in place in other regimes, other jurisdictions, such as the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, Canada, the relevant regulator there, Australia, Singapore, and so on. So this is very much part of the regulatory architecture for the licensing, the market authorization, in other words, of vaccines or indeed any other kind of medicinal product. And what the emergency procedure is essentially aimed at doing is ensuring that when we're faced with an emergency, an acute public health concern problem like this pandemic, we're lucky not to have had, say, H1N1, like, was that back 2009, become a pandemic on this scale, indeed Ebola. But this is what we're facing now, COVID-19. We have the emergency procedures in place to ensure that there is available, as soon as possible, vaccines to deal with it, to try and help prevent infection. So this is about trying to ensure that the vaccines are available as fast as possible, but without compromising safety. So just to go into the detail a bit more, what essentially happens, and this is my understanding, is that the review processes are carried out more speedily. That isn't because shortcuts are being made, it's because there is more intense focus and attention on this particular issue, on the vaccines that are coming forward and being presented to the regulators for potential licensing, right? So there's a reprioritization of the work of the regulators so that they focus on vaccines. That's what the emergency procedure is about. It's not about reducing standards, not about watering them down. And as I mentioned, authorization under the emergency procedure is actually conditional. So what that means is that there's a requirement for more data to be provided by the manufacturers of vaccines as it becomes available, so that the regulators can look at it to ensure that not just efficacy is maintained, but that safety is maintained as well. So hopefully that responds adequately.
That's really helpful, Mark. I think you're saying clearly there that it's going through the same procedures, but it's given a greater priority, more resource within the regulators. There's a number of questions here about immunocompromised individuals. So I think these are for Sheena. Any concerns about vaccinating immunocompromised individuals? What are Sheena's thoughts on the benefits or protection levels for immunosuppressed patients and clinically extremely vulnerable people?
So I guess the main concern there is that they may not make such good responses. And it becomes a real unknown there. As I mentioned, in the talk, we're looking forward eagerly to hearing what the threshold of immunity required is. It may indeed prove to be quite low, and certainly I'm not absolutely sure of the recent data, of the most up-to-date data, but for hepatitis B, I'm not sure if there have been any cases of liver cancer reported in people who are vaccinated. So one of the goals in terms of severe disease of the hepatitis B vaccination campaign is to prevent liver cancer, obviously to prevent the infection itself, but to prevent long-term side effects, long-term toxicity from Hep B. And so for quite a while, it was felt that even though we couldn't measure immune responses, there might still be some clinical protection. And only time is going to tell us that. I don't have concerns about the licensed vaccines being given to people who are immunocompromised. They would not be contraindicated. If there was an issue there, then MHRA would and the regulators would tell us that. So I think no problem in terms of safety, but the effectiveness is questionable, and that would have to be monitored and time will tell.
And another one for you, Sheena. So was scientific evidence presented to support the government strategy of mixing and matching the vaccine and extending the timescales between doses? Now, you certainly talked a bit about this. This has been in the media a lot, and it's obviously a very real issue in people's lives at the minute. Healthcare workers who have had one dose and we're expecting the second in a few weeks and have been told that's being postponed. So what is the evidence to support that mixing and matching the vaccines and also extending the period between the doses?
So certainly that's been looked at in the preclinical space and is being looked at in the clinical space. But there is already some clinical evidence that you can combine the different vaccines. I don't know exactly what they reviewed, and they do get advanced look at data that's not always in the public domain. But I have friends who are currently, took part in the AstraZeneca trial in the States, who are now having the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine to see what happens. So I know this is very much underway, this work to assess the meaning of it. But all along, we have anticipated the need for a boosting strategy, such as we have for flu, where we roll out a different vaccine each year. And so I don't have any undue concerns about this. Perhaps, Anne, to add to that, because that I forgot to say thank you at the end of my talk to the regulators and the ethics committees who've reviewed all of these studies. They've done an outstanding job, and I know the MHRA has been inspecting both Oxford's trial and the one that I've been involved with at Imperial right from the beginning in order to be prepared for rapid review. So they have done a great job to prepare for the rapid authorisation. But we will wait and see what comes in that space. As the vaccines are using and modelling, the actual bit of the vaccine that's modelling COVID-19 is very similar in all of them. I don't anticipate a problem from this mixing.
Okay, thank you, Sheena. Can I encourage everyone to continue to submit questions? There's loads of questions have come in, but please do take part and ask your questions. Great opportunity to ask Sheena and Mark. Most people, when they submit their questions, are putting them in anonymously, but we have a few names. So thank you, Clara, for your question. Question, I think, to start with Mark on this one. Do you feel there's a case for a mandatory vaccine policy in the instance of this global health emergency? If so, what form of that would be ethically justifiable?
So that's a big question. That's a huge question, right? And it's very welcome. It's one that I've been thinking about, but I don't think backed up by the UK's de facto Bioethics Council, the Nuffield Council. As de facto, it's not officially the Ethics Council of the UK, or perhaps just England. But I don't think that mandatory vaccination is justified. It's certainly not something that as far as I can tell, has gained much traction within the legal and, or rather, ethics literature. I think, moreover, if we refer back to Sheena's talk, so if we look at the evidence and try to actually just think and reflect what it is that vaccination is trying to achieve. So I might be I might be summarising some of what Sheena has said without sophistication, so apologies to Sheena. You may wish to correct me. But as far as I can understand from Sheena's talk, but also from what I've read, we need to reach a certain level of immunity in the population, so herd immunity. But as far as we can tell, that there willingness to be vaccinated against COVID-19 is at such a level that it's likely that herd immunity will be achieved. So there isn't, when we take, I think we just take that as a really important piece of information. There isn't really, I don't think, when we look at the evidence or what's likely to happen, it seems likely that there will be a massive uptake of the vaccines. Because of that, I don't think, or at least that's part of the reasoning, because of that, in large part, mandatory vaccination could not, in my view, be justified. There are lots of other things to think about in terms of vaccination, consent requirements, right? Consent to any sort of intervention, consent more broadly. Consent's really important in our society or our societies across these islands and further afield. And it's something that we shouldn't look to trade away lightly on the basis of the goal of, say, protecting public health more widely. And that's something that I underscored when we look at the law, the legal instruments, but also the ethical frameworks that underpin them. You can see that the individual isn't to be overridden in the name of society or societal protection, public health protection more generally. But going back to, as I say, the evidence, it doesn't really seem that achieving herd immunity, the main goal of vaccination, is going to be a problem, because take-up is likely to allow us to reach that level. And so I think that's my main point in response. I can't see that mandatory vaccination is something that is warranted. I'll say one more thing, if I may. Sorry if I'm taking up too much time, but I think I can understand where one might be coming from in thinking, well, why don't we just have mandatory vaccination? Why not? Or shouldn't we? These sorts of questions, right? But as I've said, although we are living through a period that is unparalleled in our lifetimes and for an awful long time, and it's causing a lot of hardship for all of us, really. But some people, it has to be said, far more than others, still, I think we're likely to achieve our public health goals on the basis of voluntary take-up of the vaccines. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. Sheena, do you want to make any comment on that one?
Yeah, no, I'm just to say I completely agree with Mark. I think consent should be protected. I don't feel it will be necessary. I had a quick look to see what JCVI said about coverage, and they just say good, so not defined, but they're keeping a close eye on it, and I'm sure that won't be necessary. I'd feel most uncomfortable. We've been in this space around HIV for other things. We don't have a vaccine that works, but we have other things that do work, and it's never helpful for doing things in partnership with the public. So yeah, I agree with Mark completely.
I think, throughout COVID, we've seen really starkly the balance between the need to protect public health, but then also individuals' rights and individuals' personal decision-making about their own protection. How do you see that balance between the public health imperative and personal protection working itself out in this vaccination programme? Mark, do you want to talk about that?
I thought you might come back to me on this. So what do I think? I think that in terms of the vaccination program, so that's the parameter that you've set, I think that so going back to the question of mandatory vaccination, or actually maintaining voluntary vaccination and a policy of voluntariness, I think that allows us to achieve an appropriate balance between protecting the public health as a whole while maintaining at the same time individual rights. So here, consent. So it's really just an expression of individual autonomy, the individual just being able to make a decision for herself or himself or themselves, and that being protected and respected. I don't think that there is, through adhering to maintaining consent, and that as an expression of individual autonomy. I don't think that we are compromising public health. And I suppose something further, as it's coming to me as I'm thinking this through, I don't think, and I'm not saying that, I don't want to suggest that that's what you put to me, some sort of public health or, the individual, but I think it's something worthwhile to think about. I don't think it's either one or the other. I think there's a balancing exercise that has to be undertaken, and that's very much central to legal thinking, especially as informed by human rights, but also in ethics. So it's not all or nothing, right? Or it's not all one side or the other. It's actually a balancing exercise.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Do you want to add anything to that, Sheena, about the balance between public health and personal protection?
I think only to say that I'm very glad I'm not a politician. I think it's been such a difficult tightrope to tread, hasn't it? And at times, for sure, a large proportion of the population have felt their rights have been infringed by the restrictions that have been placed on them, and that is to protect public health. But at the same time, people can see that it's detrimental to the economy. So this is very, very tricky, and the politicians have a difficult job to do. They're looking not only at the science, but they're looking at all of the other pieces as well, because we can't improve anything without a thriving economy. So I don't envy them at all, Anne. I think it's a very tricky balance. But with respect to the vaccination and that side of things, I think the public, I think everyone's together in this, and we all see that that's an essential component to getting back to near normal. So there feels like a tremendous enthusiasm when you see the clips on telly and hear in the news. I feel it's a good feeling, as opposed to that fighting back against the restrictions that many people have done.
Now, I want to get on to some other questions that we've had, but Mark, I think you want to come back just quickly on that.
Yes, just very quickly. So I was just thinking, it's actually, this is in response to Sheena, what Sheena was just saying. So this is very much a dialogue in some senses, although we're not in the same room. It's kind of hard to realise that there's a dialogue going on, I think. But I just wanted to speak to the core of really what Sheena was saying there. And I think there's something really important to think about in terms of the tools available to deal with this pandemic. So we've got, these days we're told to wear a mask quite rightly because the evidence does show that mask wearing is very, very important. It actually works, or it just seems to work. But also social distancing, hand washing, all of those sorts of things. Now, I think what we've seen is, at least lately, a growing tendency among some parts of the population, some sectors of the population, to refuse to wear masks, not to abide by social distancing, so on and so forth. I think if we were, so this is going back to the question about mandatory vaccination. I think if there were to be mandatory vaccination, and again, I don't think anyone seriously proposes that, it would undermine the overall effort, or could potentially undermine the overall effort, the efficacy, if we like, of the other tools that are in place. And we have to bear in mind also that law, so where there is legal backing for these different kinds of tools, or even if we've just got these tools and there isn't legal backing, but there's a strong focus on these tools and trying to make sure that they are implemented, they're only going to be effective really if people are wearing masks, say, or effectively social distancing or distancing themselves socially. And if they are not, if there is enforcement possible. But then there's a question of who's going to enforce, how are we possibly going to achieve that? It's going to be very, very hard to achieve that. Police forces, authorities say it's really hard to enforce the rules as they are. So we have to be really careful about trying to ensure that there's an optimal, and I say optimal response, so that most people, hopefully nearly all people actually do abide by the rules, whether they have a legal backing or not. But going back then to vaccination, mandatory vaccination, I think in some people's minds would actually give them a sense of being justified, perhaps, or provide some sort of grounds upon which they can then say, well, I'm not abiding by any of this, because, well, they feel forced, coerced, and they maybe haven't been given the information, or they've been given misinformation to fuel their particular response. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark and Sheena, for that. Just a really practical, real-world question here from Charlene. Regarding members of the public, and there might be family or friends, people we know, that doubt the need for a vaccine or believe in conspiracy theories, what would you say in terms of advice on how to convince them or educate them? Sheena, that's one for you, I think.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, isn't it? All that stuff on social media platforms can be quite convincing when you read it. But it's a long history of the role of vaccination in control of infectious disease that comes on the side of the need for a vaccine to control an infectious disease. And the reason it's doing it is by reducing the infection in the community. So truly at that community level. And this is what we do need to get to in order for everybody to be protected. So you may not be doing it for yourself because the risks seem low, but you're doing it for other people. Now, if you have a really strong concern, then I would like to think there is your own doctor. There are many people who you can speak to seek reassurance. But right now, the stuff on mainstream media is as up to date as the scientific journals and is made very digestible for us by people who are good at translating into language that makes sense. I don't know if that helps, Anne. I find that if you really when you're talking to individuals, sometimes a very, very firmly held belief is hard to unstick. And sometimes you can't resolve that at an individual level. But I've been impressed by the information in mainstream media and how clear it is. So,
Mark, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, just to try and add something to what Sheena said, I think I can't. I don't want to put words in Sheena's mouth, but both Sheena and I and our colleagues are all academics, and we're all trying to ensure one version of our job, or part of our job, is to ensure that there is some sort of truth out there, that there's a sound basis for decisions that are taken by lawmakers, so that's legislators in particular, by the regulators. But moreover, what we're interested in is ensuring, well, at least from a legal perspective, we're interested in ensuring accountability, where decisions haven't been taken on the basis of sound evidence, for instance. But at this moment, we cannot see those working in this area, especially in the legal and regulatory studies field, we can't see a basis on which to critique the decisions being made. They are being made in accordance with and under the law, the regulatory frameworks that are in place. And again, they are about trying to ensure safety. I think perhaps safety above all, of course effectiveness, but safety. So if there were something to be concerned about, I imagine there'd be people such as Sheena, but then also people in the social sciences like myself who would be performing a critique, who would be making known our concerns, and where well, at least I'm pretty good at saying what I think. It's part of the job, right? So if there were a problem, if there were a concern, you would hear about it from the academics. We're independent of government, of regulators. It's part of our job.
Thank you both for that. Now, just to move on, there are a number of questions about groups who were not included in the trials and what the vaccination might mean for them. So the first one I want to ask you about is pregnant women. So that pregnant women are not included in the trials, as far as I know. What are the main concerns about the effectiveness and safety of the vaccine for pregnant women?
So you're absolutely right, Anne, and that's standard practice that you would not include pregnant women at the beginning or children. So you work your way into those communities. And I know there are trials going on now looking at the safety of vaccine in pregnant women. And you can do quite a lot before you go to the trials in terms of looking at the safety in animals that are pregnant. And everything has been very reassuring to date, and has to be in order for the regulators to approve those trials to go forward in pregnant women. So we have some reassurance from those data, but at the end of the day, we want to collect the clinical data and extend enormous thanks to those pregnant women who are volunteering to take part in the trials. And what you would do typically is start at the end of pregnancy when there will be less risk if there are adverse reactions, because the baby's, obviously almost completely grown, and then work your way back through to the early pregnancy. But probably the greatest risk, I think, from any drugs come in that first third of pregnancy, and whether we will get to that stage or not, I am not sure. One would hope, obviously, if we manage to get control of the epidemic, that just through taking some measures of precaution, the population risk would drop, and then women would not need to be vaccinated in that trimester of pregnancy. They would get vaccinated before they get pregnant, etc. That's where we are. They're looking now.
And you mentioned children as well, Sheena, in that answer. So there's no plan to vaccinate children, but those of us who are parents will know that our children do get a flu vaccination every year. So how is that likely to progress over time?
So that also progresses. They look back down the age group. So I think you're pretty confident in the safety down to 12-year-olds based on the adult data. And then below that, you want to look in the younger age groups. But I think there's quite a debate about the role that children play in transmission. I feel at the moment the consensus is that children in secondary school play an important role. And then just more recently, I've seen some things in the literature suggesting, or the media, again, suggesting that actually maybe younger children also play a role in transmission. But once more, if we can get to that magic level in the community, that means we've got the reproduction rate of the virus down really low. It shouldn't be necessary to go to those age groups. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I imagine the booster strategy is also going to focus on people in the older age groups at risk of severe disease, rather than the entire population, the more bigger population.
Okay, I'm getting towards the end of our time here. Can I just say thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions. It's been really great to have your participation and hopefully to address the topics that you're interested in. Again, a practical question. Is there a place for vaccination passports?
Yeah.
Mark? Oh, sorry, Sheena. Sheena, you go for it first.
I'm dying to hear what Mark's got to say.
I don't necessarily have a clear answer to that question. Vaccination passports. I think so. This is just an initial response. I'd have to think about this in more depth. But my initial response is something like the following. I tend to think that if I understand the premise of the vaccination passport, it's to facilitate movement of people, right? To say, I've been vaccinated, so it's safe for me to travel around. I think that's the idea, right? Okay. Or presumably, I suppose there's some questions to ask. And my initial response then, would they be voluntary or mandatory? There's a big question there. I'm not sufficiently familiar with the discussion around vaccination passports to really know where things stand in terms of what might be being discussed or what could even be then proposed. But are they voluntary, or is the idea that they would be voluntary or mandatory? If they were mandatory, I would start to have big concerns around them, and that they effectively go to questions around then what we've spoken about, what we've discussed before, which relates to mandatory vaccination. So makes me uneasy having if they were to be mandatory. But I mean, Sheena's raising her hand. Maybe she knows more about this issue than I do. I think if I could just say this, I tend to think that actually just sticking to the guidance, not looking for shortcuts, wanting to travel unnecessarily, I think that's the safest option. And I could be wrong, but it sounds to me like vaccination passports, again, if I understand the premise correctly, is a way of just trying to find ways around the rules that everyone else is living under. So I'll pass over to Sheena.
Sheena, do you want to comment on vaccination passports?
No, not necessarily an answer to COVID-19, but speaking from the yellow fever experience, because I carried one of those with me, a little yellow fever vaccination card for years, because you couldn't go to East Africa using it. And indeed, even if you went through East Africa onto South Africa and you arrived without it and said you'd been through, Tanzania or Uganda, then you would be sent off to the health service and you would be vaccinated. So it's not exactly a mandatory passport in a way, but you couldn't get in. I couldn't get into South Africa without going to be vaccinated. And yellow fever is a live viral vector, so carries considerably more risk than the vaccines we're looking at the moment. And the lady I was traveling with was on steroids and was very immunosuppressed. And she said, I can't have this virus, this vector, this vaccine. And I was able to prevent her from being vaccinated. So that wasn't mandatory in that sense. But as I say, the pathway for South Africa for me was that I hadn't got my bit of paper and I had to go and have another yellow fever jab. But this is kept under surveillance the whole time. And I think that's probably an example where we reached a point where the harms from these repeat vaccinations with yellow fever outweighed the benefits in terms of risk being introduced to other countries. And I think that's changed. So I think there's a history here, Mark and Anne, that we could look at, that it's fascinating. And I do see those passports more as being permission for you to come into my country, especially if you're coming from a country like ours, which has had such high rates of infection.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to ask one final question and then hand over to Stuart, who's going to round up. So for a very quick answer, a very short answer, just say 30 to 60 seconds, from all your learning and experience of recent months and COVID and the development of vaccines, what would be your one big policy message for the government for the future? Sheena, start with you.
Whoa. I'd say build that capacity. So whatever it takes, make sure we're not in this space without the bed and manpower capacity in hospitals to cope with the future pandemic. And please ensure we've got a manufacturing base. There are so many things government's done well. There are so many things all the partners have done well. But those are areas. Make sure we can scale up the testing. Make sure we've got the manpower to cope with the surge. And please have the manufacturing base close to hand. I guess those would be my three things I'd ask for.
Great, thank you, Sheena. Mark, what would be your big message for the government from your learning of recent times? Mark, you're on mute.
I muted myself to save bandwidth. No. Anyway, so to respond, I agree entirely with what Sheena has just said. I think to try to add to what Sheena said, the thing that has really struck me the most is that there is a dire need for government to respond as quickly as possible. I think, I think it's borne out very clearly in what's happened over the last year, and especially just over the last 2 months, that government responds far too slowly, and we see what happens as a consequence of slow action. So that's all I want to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheena and Mark, for taking all those questions, which really were many and varied. So thank you for being so quick and agile to respond to different topics there. And thank you to all of those watching and listening who submitted questions that really helped to add extra flavour and interest to the event. So thank you for your participation in that. I'm just going to hand over now to Professor Stuart Elwyn from Queen's University, who will round up the event.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to both Sheena and Mark. We've been privileged over this lunchtime to hear two individuals at the top of their game, really at the business end of the challenges that we're facing during this pandemic. And I want to thank them both enormously for their contribution in their talks and in their responses to the questions, which I think were really helpful and enlightening. I also want to thank Sheena for her and her team who are working hard to help with further vaccine programs. As is often said, this is not going to be over for some time, and we need to keep the enthusiasm in the academic arenas and in the health service to really make sure we come through this as a society. I think one of the interesting areas of questions that we've explored is the social contract and the role of legislation versus bringing the community with us. And I think the pandemic has really brought together wide disciplines that need to work together for the good of society. We need the science, we need the medicine, but there are also challenges around how we implement, how do we educate, how do we encourage society in behaviours which are good for them and good for each other. And there are many challenges that still face us around all of those issues. But I think this has been an opportunity to hear some really strong evidence and have some really engaged discussions, which I hope helps you in your thinking around this challenging area. Finally, just to thank Anne for chairing. It was an excellent questions and excellent flow during that time. And also to Gordon, Morris and Aileen for their support and backup to make this Zoom work so smoothly. And finally, to thank you as the audience for joining us. Thank you for participating. There is a regular series of these events over the next number of months, some of which will have COVID relationships, but also in other important areas around social policy, politics, and other important areas that challenge us as a society. Finally, just to remind you, there is a recording that you can pick up and share, hopefully with friends and colleagues, and we hope that will be. So thank you very much, and I hope the rest of your day goes well. The rain has stopped in Northern Ireland, the sun has come out, and hopefully the future for us as a society will be coming out of this stronger, more engaged with each other, more committed to looking after and supporting each other through difficult times. So thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.